there were people's bodies who were dug up from graves, right, because people couldn't protect their graves, and then they were used for early cadaver practice. I mean, it's a long, long history. It's not Tuskegee that happened, in 1932 to 72. And a lot of these things, I think, get spelled out in great books like Vanessa Gamble's In the Shadow of Tuskegee, or this great piece from Randall called Slavery, Segregation, and Racism, Trusting the Healthcare System Ain't Always Easy. And it's about not just now, right, but this long trajectory of good reasons for distrust. And then it extends on, right, sometimes people think that it happened with Tuskegee, and then, right, that was the work. And it just keeps going on, right? There are many more reasons to continue this kind of distrust. And it sort of comes through the decades since then, right? So when Annette and I were working on the book, Krause and Quinn had done all this work with African American communities in Baltimore about beliefs about AIDS and how it was created or, made to be a genocide for certain populations. And I think one of the interesting features there is that people who aren't part of those communities look at that claim and think it's paranoia, right? It's conspiracy. How can somebody possibly believe this? And that's not recognizing why that view might seem incredibly rational given the history and the legacy, right, of misuse and abuse through experimentation. And of course we have the Henrietta Lacks story more recently. I can just keep going on, but I'm not a historian, so we'll let that suffice. I even had more things. So there are always, in bioethics, which is my world, discussions about organ donation, right? We know that there are disparities in terms of who waits on the list for scarce organs longer. So there are regularly discussions about trying to implement systems where we either have presumed consent or where we have sort of a pay-to-play model where if you offer to donate your organs, right, should you be in a position where you're dead and they're able to take your organs, then you'd be more likely to be prioritized on the list, right? But that puts certain people in double jeopardy because if they're more likely to be on the list in the first place and they're more likely to have what I would call rational distrust of the healthcare system, they're unlikely to sign up for that list because of this worry that if I go in there, if I could be saved and somebody sees this, then I'm less likely to get the care I need, right? And I think there's just this disconnect because physicians will often think, but that's irrational, right? You wouldn't be offered lesser care. But that's not, again, recognizing the legitimacy of the distrust given this long history that's there. So, right, I think one of the worries is we're going to find researchers who say things like, I'm well-intentioned, and you don't have reason to distrust me, so can I just show you what I'm doing, and maybe we can get along, we can work this out and do whatever our research project is. What I want to say is the researcher is going to need to demonstrate trustworthiness, right, and to offer some credibility to the person that they're trying to work with in order to build trust. You can't just hear the refrain, which I think isn't often explicitly voiced, but is there in the background. Tuskegee happened a long time ago. I wasn't part of that. It was terrible. This is different, right? Sorry, it won't work. So we want to look back at these histories or this legacy of distrust. And here I think part of what I want to focus on is the importance of recognition. So in a lot of work about disparities, I think some of the focus has been on access to care, right? How do you make sure, given social determinants of health, and just given the difficulty of getting into the healthcare system, maybe now made more difficult, right? Looking like it all the time. How do you make sure that people have access to the kinds of care that are important to preserve our health and well-being? But I also want, so distribution matters, right, when we talk about healthcare justice, but it's also important to look at what somebody like Nancy Fraser, a political theorist, would call justice as recognition, right? To hear what somebody who is meant to be a partner in some collaboration says and how their perspective may be different from the one that you're coming from, right, as a medical researcher or a clinician. And recognition, right, for her was about participatory parity, trying to make sure that people are represented that they come to the table, not just be invited right into an academic setting to sit somewhere and not necessarily feel comfortable and know the language, but to make sure that people have an equal chance to express their views. Not just, again, to say them, but to have them appreciated and respected, right? And that's different because you can give somebody a chance to speak, but not actually listen, right? Or not do anything in response to it. And so it seems like what we need to start addressing this legacy of distrust is, first off, a recognition of the rationality of that distrust. And then, right, some recognition of differing perspectives and trying then to build a bridge to work together on how to address some of those systems. So this has to be moving away from the sort of worries and claims about, or charges of paranoia, to saying, I understand where you're coming from, and I can see why this makes sense given the way that systematically, right, and Tim will talk about this more, in policing, in the media, certain kinds of lies are devalued relative to other kinds of lies, and that's going to end up being true across the systems, even within the medical system. So how are we going to build trust? What does it mean to demonstrate trustworthiness? I want to go back to philosopher Annette Byer's work. She had famous piece, Trust and Antitrust, from some time ago, but I think she said this really well. And at the time, she noted that philosophers have too often likely focused on contracts, right? On the social contract, on how autonomous individuals come together and we have, roughly equal power and we make agreements with each other and then abide by those agreements. But that doesn't recognize that trust has to underlie those kinds of agreements, even if we have contracts. And part of what she wants to say is people are actually so differently positioned that we can't think about trust. We can't think about contracts that make sense in light of these power asymmetries. So she says, trust requires us to make ourselves vulnerable to another, right? If we aren't vulnerable, then we don't need to trust anybody. So if you have a very clear contract with everything enumerated, you don't have a lot of reason to have to trust anymore. But if you are making yourself vulnerable, then that's what makes trust a requirement. And interestingly, trust involves significant discretionary power on the part of the trusted. So again, if you have a complete contract of what somebody needs to do, there isn't a lot of discretionary room. It's just, these are the enumerated things that you must do. And I think this happens within the medical setting, whether we're talking about clinical care or research, right? I offer my body, and I have to trust you to know what you're doing to treat me fairly. And I don't know the details of what that's going to look like necessarily myself. And you have this amazing discretionary power to use that trust in ways that you see fit. So I'm also in that trusting relationship, expecting competence from you, right, as the person I'm trusting. And in the philosopher's world, right, different sorts of things, but maybe something like goodwill. I expect goodwill from you toward me. I expect you to treat my interests as something valuable. And I think that's where, when we look at the legacies of distrust, we can see why there isn't optimism about you taking my interests seriously, right? Given what I've seen happening, given what I see currently happening around me, there's not going to be that kind of optimism. And so there can't be trust. There might be reliance, right, a lesser level. I have to get medical care, so I have to rely on you to do something, but I don't actually trust you, right? We don't have this right kind of relationship where I believe that you have goodwill toward me to do the things that I'm going to need you to do. And so I think, right, if we want to figure out how we go about restoring trust or demonstrating trustworthiness, it has to be about demonstrating that kind of goodwill, showing the possibility of building that relationship where I take your interest very seriously. Yes. And to do that, I won't go into detail, but I think in work that I've done with some of the people down at the medical center, with Colleen and Malia, who are in the audience, one thing in medical research is really thinking about power sharing. So thinking about CVPR, community-based participatory research, right? Trying to do things where I think what happens is the researcher is actually made vulnerable to the partner. Because if they don't want to do things, if they don't have the same sort of goodwill, the research just won't proceed. And that's uncomfortable, and people don't want to do it. And also, it's not just about their individual intentions or willingness, it's about the structural system around us, right? That getting tenure is going to be more difficult. Grants don't really support this kind of work. And so we have to work on changing that structure of medical research as well. But I think that's what really has to be done in order to start rebuilding trust so that we can change, right, this legacy of distrust and get to one of trusting relationships. I hand it to Tim.
Hello, everybody. Well, is this thing on?
Yes.
Okay, good. So to keep things brief, I've prepared a set of comments, but first I'll say that what I say is meant to be sort of an extension of what has been said before and sort of the bizarro converse version of what Sara has just said. Yeah, almost converse, I think so. So sometimes we forget that people of color do not distrust the medical establishment simply on principle or simply on retellings of history alone. These reasons would be good enough to be wary during doctor's visits, but we must remember that it is simply the case that people of color are too often subject to injustices as soon as they enter the hospital, and tragedies befall people of color who call 911. So just as an undocumented immigrant faces the risk of ICE detainment or deportation at the hospital, just as Lucilo Molina did last year after an emergency open heart procedure, the children of undocumented immigrants will face condescension or outright contempt from medical professionals for their cultural differences. And just as black people face the risk of being the target of brutality every time they leave the house, we cannot trust emergency services to know the difference between situations that require medical care and situations that require a show of force, which are usually not at all, none. These scenarios, however, are framed in terms of how people of color mistrust the medical system, and solutions to the problem seem to come in the form of winning the trust of this constellation of communities. It seems to me, however, that the converse is more to the point. The medical system mistrusts people of color, and people of color simply do not want to be the subject of what I'll call irrational mistrust and denigration that ensues from it. This is its own legacy of distrust. Take, for example, how NYPD officer, it makes me shudder to say NYPD anymore, Daniel Pantaleo ignored Eric Garner's pleas that he could not breathe and continued to hold him in a chokehold. One can see shades of this treatment in 2006 meta-analysis of articles on pain management, and I believe this was mentioned earlier, that people of color are less likely to be taken seriously when they say they're in pain, and are less likely to receive adequate pain management when they request it. This is, at least in part, an epistemic problem, a problem with how we regard people of color as knowers. Within the medical system, there is a failure to recognize the testimonies of certain kinds of people, the colorful kind, and two, there is a move to argue against people with dissenting testimonies that do not buckle under social pressure. These moves are a kind of violence. So in her seminal piece, Tracking Epistemic Violence, Christy Dotson defines the titular term as the refusal, intentional or unintentional, and I want to emphasize how intentional it can be at times, of an audience to communicatively reciprocate a linguistic exchange owing to consistent forms of ignorance that harm other people. Dotson's goal was to uncover and track the ways that people of color are either one, coerced into smothering their own testimony out of worry that their testimony will not receive uptake, or two, discredited as knowers in the first place, and therefore quieted. I believe these kinds of violence are in play when people of color come into contact with the medical establishment. For example, it is a reliable, persistent, systemic ignorance that results in black children being disproportionately diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD, according to Nancy Potter, who was also a presenter at this very conference in 2012. So keeping the legacy alive. She argues in multiple venues that the diagnosis of ODD often encapsulates dismissive white interpretations of black behavior. ODD is characterized by, quote, the persistent stubbornness, resistance to directions, and unwillingness to compromise, give in, or negotiate with adults or peers. But what happens when stubbornness and resistance are justified? For children of color struggling with mental health problems, the word defiant is often the prelude to a lifetime of epistemic injustices that they have every right to resist. But any attempt to resist the charge of being defiant is itself a form of defiance, and therefore self-defeating. Children like these, children like I once was, and the person who dropped out of high school to go to college because of these features, are stuck between the indignity of docility and the relative dignity of defiance. This is a difficult decision to make. Many of us just walk the middle path. These kinds of charges against people of color seem to permeate medical practice. We've already seen from Janice and Crystal that varieties of studies suggest that white physicians consider their white patients more able to afford treatment, more likely to comply with medical advice, and more willing to make requests on their own behalf. These last two attitudes closely resemble the earlier mentioned double bind. How can a person of color make requests for themselves when it's possible that would make them seem less likely to comply with medical advice? What do you do? And if the medical system does not trust people of color to know what their needs are, to participate in medical treatment, or even to act rationally, then participation in medical research is just a pipe dream. My contact with medical research is through neural engineering, and that hard to pronounce center. Much of my own research deals in the moral and societal implications of deep brain stimulation. These are implanted systems that treat the symptoms of motor disorders like Parkinson's and essential tremor by applying electrical current to specific areas of the brain. I conduct interviews with patients using these systems in order to determine what effect these devices have on their sense of self. But my patients so far are only white men, and I often wonder why. Moreover, many of my white colleagues have friends, family members, or acquaintances outside of academia that have at least heard of deep brain stimulation. This is usually not the case in my family. None of them have ever heard of neural stimulation before. It's no wonder why, though. I can hardly imagine a physician referring one of my family members to a neurologist. I hadn't even heard of the title neurologist until I came to the UW. And I certainly can't imagine a neurologist suggesting deep brain stimulation to one of my family members. So how can people of color ever come to trust the medical system if they're not even trusted enough to be given access to a significant portion of it? This is a challenge that I struggle with as I learn that my study will likely never have contact with people of color. So what are solutions to this? I can imagine solutions, but they require a great deal of introspective and structural work. First, practitioners and researchers, and from here on out I say we, because that's who's here, need to make themselves aware of their own mistrust of communities of color. Why leave it up to, why think of ourselves as reaching out to communities of color that mistrust us when we don't even trust them in the first place? I do not think participatory parity is even possible if we are not honest with ourselves about our prejudices. Second, we must recognize both the moral and epistemic value of having people of color as patients, study participants, colleagues, and argue for it with our colleagues, as our two previous speakers just did. And third, we must do the slow, arduous work of paying attention to the people that it is too easy to dismiss. This requires that we restructure our studies, rethink our clinical and academic practices, and most importantly, listening more than we speak. And that's it.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Thank you, Tim and Sara, and also again to Janice and Crystal. What I'd like to do now is open it up to the audience, to the speakers, to give comments, feedback, questions. If you would like to raise your hand, hands any of you who have questions or comments that you'd like to make, I'll call on you. Anyone like to start us off?
I'm sorry for depressing everybody.
Yes, and if you could perhaps stand up so that everyone can hear. Thank you.
Hi, Malia Fullerton, Bioethics and Humanities. Thank you all so much for your presentation. Incredibly thought-provoking. I guess I would like to invite any or all of you to talk specifically about this issue of humility, which I think came up in all of your presentations in various ways, and how you think about the project of humility on the part of both the research community as well as the clinical community relative to this problem of implicit bias. So as we become aware of our biases, is that a project in humility, or how does awareness translate into humility, and how do we get there in terms of trying to achieve better parity of participation, better equity in the ways that you guys have been talking about?
Well, can you hear me? I've thought about this a lot, and just being aware that you have bias. First of all, many people are not aware, so that's starting there. But even if you become aware of biases in certain areas, and it doesn't mean you have to take a test to do it. You can be interacting with someone and realize you had a whole scenario going that is completely wrong. So you've already been developing impressions and have certain biases about this person's situation. Being aware of it can operate in several ways. A person can become very defensive. So one of the problems with forcing people into this awareness mode is that, you take an altruistic medical student, make them confront their bias, and all of a sudden they say, I can't work with that type of person. I'm just not good at it. So that's not where we want to go. And I think, kind of that humility piece, I just see it as being, and maybe it's kind of a personal maturity or something that a person is able to get to the point where they are just open and humble to understand. I have almost like a visceral vision of it as just being open, understanding I'm not perfect, I don't have all the answers, I make mistakes. So that kind of humility where you can actually get sort of this base level of communication, that's how I view it. It isn't only cultural humility, which is an entity in and of itself. It's just being personally vulnerable and open. And many people don't get there. They get very defensive. It's like, well, that's those other people out there. It's not me. Or, So I think coming to that point it's a process.
Can I just say that we're just having a bit of trouble at the back of the room hearing you. We're trying to get someone to come and work on the microphones. The thing is, they are on. If you could really just speak. I'm totally going to mute let's wait for that one to recover. Sorry about that. If you could speak loudly or speak straight into the microphone, sorry about that. We've got them at the highest volume possible. I'd like to just take a question right at the back over there.
I'm Helene Starks, also from Bioethics and Humanities. And Janice, I appreciate your the notion of owning this personally for humility, but I'm seeing all my palliative care colleagues here who work on creating spaces where you can do that. I think it's really hard to ask clinicians to go in and do the work they do every day, which means both putting on kind of a mylar shield of protection so that you can get through your day and do all the work, because you have to come in contact with so many different people and do so much interaction on the fly all the time, changing it up. And then we expect them to sort of leave that at the door and open their hearts and embrace everything that comes at them. So I want to say that if we are locating humility at the level of the individual, that is a place to start. But if we are also not working on systems that make spaces for people to be humble by acknowledging all of these things, but it takes space and time, and that is not something that somebody who's on the fly doing their best every day just to sort of get through the day and do all that they're responsible for. That's got to be a both and. And I see Crystal's all ready to go. So.
Working in the ICU, I know this problem very well. Sorry. Is this on? No. I'll just yell.
Stand up.
Okay.
You can project. I think if you stand when you then it will be better.
Yeah.
It's hard to see. So I would just say I think working in the ICU, I know this problem very well, and I think another way to think about humility may be encouraging people to have a little more empathy also. So, and I think that Helena's point about creating space is really, really important, because it's so infrequent that we stop and pause when we have a complicated case, or what we call a difficult patient, or a case that we're, just a case that we're really frustrated with. It's so easy to kind of keep going and kind of feed into all of our implicit biases and our frustrations. But I think that pause and creating that space is really important. So I know that, for example, at UW, we've created ethics rounds, spaces for moral distress, for people to have the space to pause and sit with another companion, and to sort of debrief about that moral distress. And I know, for example, we also have death rounds at the UW ICU where we could talk about, where we do have that space to sort of pause and maybe have a little bit of humility, or to have some empathy for the patients or the family members that we thought were difficult, or that we had biases against. So I think that's a really good, important piece of that.
Just have somebody coming in to check our mics. We're just having difficulty. Sometimes they're a little bit too loud, sometimes they're too soft.
Either way, all the lights are just
This
this
one.
sound.
So far.
So far,
Should we take some questions while we sort this out?
Yeah, I had a question, and I'm curious how this is. I know this is sort of this might seem like a naive question, but in sort of everyday situations, or talking to people who've taken the AIT and are working for organizations outside of healthcare, for example. Like I just did something like with some tech people. One thing that I often hear after people take the test is, we're all biased, but that's the end. It's like, we're all biased, and so now it's good now, because we're all biased, and that there's no, that's sort of the end of the discussion, and there's no, so I guess, I know we were talking about sort of the converse, people who become really, who feel like they're very egalitarian, and they're learning for the first time that they have biases that they never knew they had, and how that might impact. But what also happens to people who sort of just internalize this idea that we're all biased, so there's no need to change? I guess it gets to structure. But does that happen, and how do you move on from that? And it seems like people who've done these trainings, not saying you're training,
No,
but
I know.
they will come and they're like, it's great, like we're all racist.
And I gotta tell you, I'm not a huge fan of like the whole training enterprise.
Yeah.
Because it can be anything, and nobody is evaluating the outcomes of trainings. Do they change behavior? Does anything happen differently? But that's why collecting data is really important. So yes, implicit bias is kind of ubiquitous, and there's so many areas. But in an organization, a tech company, collect data. What is equity happening in delivery of products, in hiring profiles? And if it is, then okay, there's bias, but we're doing a good job. But most likely, in tech, for example, we're the girls, so if you really think about it, okay, there's bias, but also there's inequity, and that's what you start working on. It isn't just like, okay, so we all are racist, ageist, all these other things, and there's nothing that can be done. That's just the beginning to kind of get to that point of understanding these mechanisms are operating in organizations, in institutions, in policy making, and then measuring what are the impacts. And I think that's the important part, is beginning with collecting data.
And then the structural, so then what are the structural things? I'm a sociologist.
Well, I'll just say one thing about that, and that is standardization is really important, because a lot of areas are so subjective evaluation. Even like, organ donation, can people actually meet all the steps they need to do to be compliant? Well, compliance, that's very subjective. So that's what I think standardizing processes, so a lot of the discretion is removed.
Okay, we're gonna do a quick microphone check.
I'll just talk.
Check.
I don't want to touch it.
1, 2, 3, check, check.
Okay, but like move it around.
Because she's here.
No, that's not really.
That's
That's
that.
just cool.
Oh, it's half unplugged. Nice.
I turned it down as a simple one. I think it's either 4 or 5. You'll see on there. You need to adjust it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Unless there's anything else.
There was a hand over here. Yes.
Can I just
Oh,
say
yes,
something about the
sorry, of course.
systematicity part?
Yes.
Me and Sara, we've worked with that mouthful organization since the Center for Sensory Motor Neuroengineering. I've got it down to a science. And one of the things that was important in recognizing disability communities, people of color, so on and so forth, the lack of women in STEM, is building organizations into the organization that are tasked with doing the thing. So Sara's the thrust leader for what the NSF calls a thrust. There are 3 of them. We are one of them. We are 1/3 of the center. We get evaluated each year by the NSF. And I've got a lot of people in the audience who are part of this thrust, and we are charged with making sure that standards are met. What the standards are is up to us, and that's part of what it means to do work in a new field of research. And for a lot of this, it's going to be new, it's going to be interesting, and we're going to set the standards. But at least the standards are being written, and they're built into the organizations themselves. And everyone else in the organization has to take it as seriously as they take the engineering, and they have to make it part of their engineering practice as well.
I've got a question over here.
Hey there, hi. My name is Maria. I am a student at the University of Washington School of Medicine.
Can you stand up, please?
Oh,
Yeah, they
sure.
can hear you. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm a student at the University of Washington School of Medicine, and when it comes to tackling implicit bias or distrust and the way it manifests in health equities or inequities, for me, this is a project that's both like inside the house and outward facing. Of the many identity groups I fall into, one of them is Asian American, right? And I was wondering if you are familiar with any data, and Dr. Brown might be more familiar, maybe, I don't know, about Asian American physicians and their implicit biases as well, because you just hear it when you walk in. And so I'm having to do some cleaning up inside the house as well as having to deal with things that come towards you as a minority in medicine in general. If you guys have any data on it, I'd love to hear about it. If not, if you have recommendations on how to do that in-house cleaning, I'd love that too. Thank you.
So I'm sorry, what do you mean by in-house? So are you talking about how like Asian physicians are perceived? Or?
In-house cleaning as in, thank you for, so Asian Americans and their perceptions about Black or their Latino patients.
I'm not familiar with any data looking specifically at that, and I don't know if anyone here is.
Well, some of the studies I've done looking at MD implicit bias, and now I can't remember my study, but we did look at by physician ethnicity and race. and also our sexuality paper. So we did look by race and ethnicity, and there are some variations, but we found strong bias among all physicians. So there was no one group other than African American physicians that showed no bias in either direction. So, you know, it's pretty big. And, you know, we're talking about not either direction. So we're talking about, on average, no bias. So, you know, there are degrees of bias, and in the work I don't like to single out a group. For example, in the sexuality paper we did it by profession as well as gender, you know, provider profession. And so there were variances between physicians, nurses, other providers. But the point isn't to, you know, single out, oh, nurses have more bias, but everybody pretty much had bias. So it's more like, let's work on education. These are areas, these are opportunities. But yeah, so the work I've done show that all physicians have bias. Varying degrees perhaps, but African American physicians show no bias. So
I see this in the context of, like, let's say with the Trump election, the Asian Americans were like the least engaged politically. We have to ask ourselves, like, why is it an issue that Black Lives Matter is not also an issue within the Asian American communities? So I think a lot of folks here understand where I'm coming from. So that's just the context of these conversations, and it trickles up into the healthcare field. Right.
Okay, thank you. We've got quite a few questions, so thank you.
Hi, I'm Genevieve Baliwana, and I'm one of the instructors over at the School of Medicine, and I run the last course of medical school called Capstone. Your talks today really have my head spinning because I'm trying to write a session right now on how to do what's called a code discussion. So a code discussion. This is that awkward conversation that interns and first-year residents need to have very rapidly with the patient they've just met and admitted to the hospital to say, do you want us to resuscitate you or not, and to what degree, right? And so I'm thinking so much about each of the things that you've said about the implicit bias that each of us bring that's going to be amplified in the context of exhaustion and overwork. I'm thinking about how if they do it poorly, folks are going to end up with more aggressive interventions than they ever wanted. And I'm thinking about how trust is inherently hard to come by in such situations. And I'm looking for advice from you in terms of how do we train our students who are going to scatter across the country in a couple of months to many residency programs, to have this foundational skill set to be able to connect rapidly with somebody, not to misuse their power. The way that each physician does a code discussion is highly variable, right? We know that to be true, and we know that the same statistics can be spun in a way that might encourage one individual to move towards aggressive care and another not to. And I'm curious to know if any of you have looked at this before, and if any of you have any thoughts on best practices. Thanks so much, Jen, for what you said already.
We're just so bad at code talks in general. We're so bad at it. I mean, as someone who supervises residents who have these code discussions, I'll tell you what it's like. Someone's in the ER and, you know, they may or may not be doing fine or in the ICU, and then the way this is usually framed is something like, hey, if your wife's heart stops beating, do you want us to push on her chest to bring her back to life? Yeah. It's like, how do we even start having discussions with people who are disenfranchised, who already have so much mistrust, when our communication skills at baseline are so bad. I wish I had like really good advice for you. But I think one of the things that we don't do very well is I think as we continue along in training, we become sort of numb to the code discussion. It becomes a checklist, like, okay, I gotta have this. And then part of my mission order set is, are they full code or DNR? And I forgot to ask, so I'm just gonna document this. And maybe recognizing that to people who are, who have these code discussions all the time, it's not a quote big deal, but maybe emphasizing or re-emphasizing what I try to do is saying, this person may have never been asked about this at all. And you have to understand that this may be the first time they've ever had to think about this. This may be the first time that, and this person may be dying, and maybe not, but trying to emphasize that this is not a checklist conversation, that this is something in which people have to pause, acknowledge that it's a difficult conversation, acknowledge that it might have been something that they have thought about, but that they should, before moving into some sort of like a very superficial description of resuscitation that really doesn't do it justice. I also think that people are scared to talk about what resuscitation really looks like. I think people don't want to talk about how almost violent it is, because I think if people perhaps had a conversation about what CPR resuscitation really looked like and took the time to do it and to say why, even offer a recommendation, sometimes people would like that. I think it would actually go really far in building trust and helping the communication. So I don't know if that helps.
So I would also say that it seems like, it's a public service type situation where all people should be aware they should have advance directives. And this is a conversation that needs to happen before someone's in the ICU. It's like a public service campaign on these issues, and we really don't talk about it. But I used to do advanced directives with children at Children's Hospital who were about 17 and undergoing surgery, and they were totally freaked out. But they couldn't undergo surgery without this conversation. I was a social worker there. So I think this is something that isn't only individual, it's a very big societal conversation that needs to happen so that people do have advanced directives. Yes, this is what they are, instead of this bad conversation in crisis.
Can I just add one thing too? So I think, I don't do these conversations, and I'm sure some of the time there isn't a lot of time to do them, but it seems like in that context, if it's you, what's going to make you trust the physician asking you these questions, right? And you want evidence that you're heard, that you're taken seriously, that you're not just on the checklist, I have to do this. And I think some of it is just that tone of, look, I know this is going to be a hard thing, or I'm expecting it may be, but one of the things we need to talk about is what's going to happen, and it's going to be really hard. I would understand why you might be uncertain, right? I'm not going to judge you based on what you say. What do you think? And let's talk, right? So that I'm really listening to you rather than which I think often happens, right? It's time pressure and somebody has a view about what might be best in this situation and you just want to hear that and then go on rather than actually engaging that person.
Just to briefly say that, I think we try and train folks to be expressive about shared interest, but just to have the patient's voice be heard, right? To say something explicitly, not just internally processing around it, to say, I care deeply that your voice is heard among the ruckus and everything and the chaos going around here. We want to do right by you. And then have you thought about this? Right, so these are, I think we want to move in those directions, but these are inherently awkward and very brief conversations because they're part of needing to get this piece done in order to admit somebody to the hospital. And so, but I appreciate your thoughts on that.
Can you get on this point? Okay, so.
I just think the other thing I would add that I often talk to trainees about is that you've gone through ad nauseum years of training, and especially in medical school, the last 2 years, which is purely subjective evaluation of you. And you spend 2 years honing yourself to meeting other people's expectations of what success is and what you should be doing. And then you become an intern, and nobody is watching you at all, and they just care that you've gotten the work done. And so what I talk to especially new interns about is you need to develop what success looks like to yourself. You need to develop what it means for you to walk into and walk out of a room and feel like you've cared for somebody. And then after you do that, you can set the expectations for your supervisor. So you can say, I get everything else, I have to have this code discussion, I think it's gonna take me a little while, so I'm gonna come back around to it, and then you go. Because here's the other thing, is we can't function without the intern. So the bottom line is, nobody's firing you. If it takes you 30 minutes to have that discussion, they're gonna handle it, and if there was something that needed to happen for the 30 minutes you're having that discussion, the second year resident can put in the other orders. So I try to empower them to start to change the structure from within in that way and set other people's expectations. Oh, I remember people would say, oh, Kemi's on service, she's gonna be in there for 20 minutes, and I didn't care, because I just decided that that's what I was gonna do. So that would be another thing I would opt for.
We've actually got a lot of hands up, but we are running out of time. So what I would suggest is, can we ask questions over the coffee break, so that we can start on time with the next panel. So if I could just thank our speakers.